Hello everyone, today we talk about the redefinition of papacy in pre-Gregorian reforms years, which is a kind of a loose definition because the Gregorian reforms, albeit attached, as the name says, to Gregory VII, are a bit of a more expanded topic. Gregory VII today is not even considered as the most important pope, at least not the most decisive pope for the achievement of the Gregorian reforms, and definitely in spite of its enormous importance, of course, and also the roots, the progressive making of the Gregorian reforms came from a substratum that has to be understood, that goes very far back in time. On Schwerpunkt we discussed this. If you're interested, there are some videos about this stuff, about the rise of papal monarchy, the reforming papacy, etc. I created a papal history playlist dedicated to that because I wanted to distinguish it a little bit from other, just from medieval Christianity or medieval Italy, or something more specific about the papacy. So today we look essentially at the previous years during the 11th century of the Gregorian reform, not even strictly talking about the reform, but looking a bit at the characters that existed before and how they contributed in this very peculiar evolution that objectively didn't have necessarily to happen, right? There are so many factors that contributed to the Gregorian reforms, which could even fail at a certain point, and then instead came to be, and all of these little elements that apparently little sometimes had a very determinant role to change effectively the history of Western civilization forever in the second half of the 11th century. So the acceleration of a deep renewal of the church happened paradoxically when, for about 10 years, papal election had been brought under the direct imperial control. Right after that, for several years, fundamentally after the fall of the Ottonian dynasty, the papal election had become the monopolium of some influent families of the Roman aristocracy, chiefly the counts of Tusculum and the Crescenzi. So these families that had always had, in this time, quite a big influence on the city, and definitely they represented this hardcore of strictly Roman interests that went beyond the same papacy, but then naturally saw the papacy as this great promoter of their own status, and that would bring, in fact, Rome, however, at the center of Western Christianity, and in the way that we know at this point. Excuse me. As you know, before the Gregorian reforms, the big leap forward, the big step had not yet been taken. I mean, the idea that the Roman papacy was fundamentally the administrative head of the whole Christian church, right? The Western Christendom, in this case, in here we will also see the definitive break with the Eastern Church, but the theory was that theoretically every archbishopric, every metropolitic seat was basically just another bishopric that had, yes, this great influence and prestige, etc., but at the end of the day it was just another bishopric, so that in the ecumenic council it was the decision of the council, none of these metropolites that mattered. Also in here, Schwerpunkt, we discussed a lot how progressively Rome rose to this preeminence, the Roman primacy of honor, and then all the actual, the very active political intervention in the matters of the Mediterranean and Europe, etc., that objectively at this point made of Rome already the by far, really by far, the most important center of Western Christianity, and that, however, yet had not formalized by itself the idea of the papal monarchy proper, right? This idea that the popes from Rome had to literally control all the ecclesiastical administration and beyond in Western Europe. And hence where the struggle for investitures would start, etc. But that's something we will talk a little bit later. So the contrast between the Roman groups of power came to be very, very violent around 1045, and it brought to the contemporaneous presence of three popes that accused each other of simony. So essentially of purchasing the religious offices and the spiritual goods attached. So the practice of simony happened definitely also in the conferment of the papal charge, and this was not definitely a novelty. This position had always been very, very much politicized, and however, things had changed a lot in the last basically 200 years or something more, with the connection that had effectively happened with the Transalpine monarchies and the Roman papacy, and obviously this duo of the papacy of the empire that had basically to watch each other's back, while at the same time, in practice, not really yet trying to stab each other, but as you know, the struggle of investitures would be fundamentally this extremely ferocious clash between these two powers, and however, creating the big problem of effectively, that the Roman Church at this point was not, in fact, just a provincial church like all others. It was the real center of Christendom, and the papal office was very important for the same policy of the empire and for the well-being, for the welfare of the same Christian society, right? So there was no disconnection, and I think in modern terms it's relatively easy to stress the conflictual side of the story between papacy and empire, saying, well, yeah, there were kind of two different powers on their own, but at the time it was, much more than that. These two powers were essentially justifying each other in the West, and they had an enormous interaction that was based on, actual progress and orientation of the direction European growth and expansion, and in developing also new cultural models that the papacy at this point had particularly accelerated in, and was producing, in fact, a new consciousness, a new awareness about its own prerogatives, distinguished from the one of the empire. So this political problems were not new, but definitely the dramatic character of the recent events and the contemporary presence of three popes at the same time determined the intervention. Obviously, three popes that do not recognize each other, as they were, anti-popes basically. So, determined the intervention of the Emperor Henry III. Right. So I thought to stop a little bit on these figures because they're interesting on their own regard, and they are effectively these key figures that contributed to determine what the reforming papacy would come. So Henry III, emperor, Holy Roman Emperor, known as the Black in German, der Schwarze, was son. He was born in 1017 and died in 1056. He was son of Emperor Conrad II and of Giselle, the widow of Ernest I, Duke of Swabia. Henry was Duke of Swabia in his 10th year of age, and eventually of Bavaria in 1027, and later in 1038 also Swabia. And he had been crowned King of Germany since 1028, while his father was still alive, so he succeeded to him without contrasts in 1039 when Conrad had died, and from there on Henry continued in a more decisive fashion paternal policy for the strengthening of royal authority. That in Germany was quite of a big deal because of the elective monarchy, and this attempt now of centralizing the structures was at this height especially quite a feat, even if it would always remain And he obtained several successes because he obliged Vratislav, Duke of Bohemia, in 1041, and Peter, King of Hungary, in 1044, to swear an oath of vassalage, right? So recognizing the imperial vassalage. And in 1046, Henry came to Italy, where the papacy, as we have seen, was living in this very deep crisis because of the contrasts that were opposing contemporarily the three popes elected by the various noble families. These popes were Benedict IX, so called, by the way, because some were not recognized as such, of course, because they were anti-popes by the Catholic Church eventually. So Sylvester III and Gregory VI, that Henry deposed in the synods of Sutri and of Rome in 1046. So naturally, as you know, the travel to Rome was the big deal for the German monarchs, because that was the way, you know, they could be recognized and crowned by the same pope as emperors. So the synods of Sutri was particularly important, because, and also the successive one in Rome, because it was showing that the emperor had his own say after this parenthesis of relative instability, the capacity of bringing a balance, you know, pacification, which was basically what the emperor was meant to do, right? Of this troublesome Roman factions, and not just them, of course, because this was now a problem of vassals, both in Italy and in Germany, for, you know, which side they would lean, and this was creating a lot of problems for imperial authority. So Henry had Suidger, Bishop of Bamberg, elected. He was a German. He assumed the name of Clemens the Second, and Henry was crowned emperor on Christmas of the same year. After which, by the same Clemens, of course, was his man in this sense, and after which he went into southern Italy in order to affirm his own rights, his own imperial rights over the duchies of the Longobards, and to establish especially a compromise with the Normans that had started to appear in southern Italy. Eventually would form pretty solid domain. So in 1055, eventually Henry came back to Italy, called by Pope Leo IX, that we will see a bit later, as the Pope was legitimately worried by the Norman conquests, and on this occasion Henry instead limited himself just to humiliate the rebellious vassal Godfrey of Lorraine, that was married with Beatrice of Tuscany, and in the autumn of the same year he came back to Germany, where a revolt against him had risen. So Henry is this very important figure that exercised a large influence over the church and the papacy, managing to elect, in fact, time after time, 4 German prelates: Clemens II, Damasus II, Leo IX, and Victor III. So this policy had been a big deal for the Roman affairs, because, especially with the Council of Sutri, Henry had deposed all of these popes of the Roman nobility, and naming a German, right? A German bishop that, you know, at this point it's not really a matter of national identity, but it's the point that it's extraneous to the Roman environments, right? Clemens the Second. So in this way he tried basically to apply also in Rome the model of control of the church that he had started in Germany in the same way. So basically coming on the steps of the Ottonians in this idea of the bishop counts, and the idea of the direct substitution of the various prelates that were, you know, that were unfaithful to the monarchic imperial cause, etc. The problem, though, is that such measure, contrary to what one might think, such control on the papacy didn't bring to a further decadence of the Roman Church, right? The idea is that maybe I'm kind of used to the reforming instances, but this is the key. The idea is one of the great movers of the reforming papacy, one of the greatest motives had been naturally this external interference of the German monarchy over the papal election, right? So the idea was that these popes were fundamentally political pawns of the German king, emperor that eventually, was crowned by this new elected popes. So the idea that there was a moral decline in the process attached, the concept that, this is not about the church anymore, it's really about a secular power who decides who has to be here. While the church had always matured its own autonomous sphere of action and was guarding it quite jealously, but evidently in the previous centuries, the lack of a more substantial papal coordination and general direction had rendered sometimes unavoidable the interference of the imperial will on the papal affairs, and this had always been the great ambiguity between papacy and empire since the time of Charlemagne. So, however, this phase started by Henry III. It was pretty, admirable by certain standards, because the system of this so-called imperial church was based, in fact, on a careful selection, also at a moral level, of the people that had to obtain the episcopal charge. So not only the papal one, but a bit of all the bishops of the empire. Since royal power itself depended directly on their trustworthiness. So here also we talked a lot about this, specifically about the Ottonian Empire, but this was the trend that had been set in the German internal policy. The idea is that you can, and also in Italy, telling the truth, because that was the only way they could control that area, at least nominally. Because the point is that the German monarchy was too dependent on the election. There was no real center of power even in there. So, as we all have often noticed, the episcopal system, the episcopal net, was the only one who had a direct interest in supporting kind of a strong monarchy. Not because they were really, the local church was particularly fond of the strengthening of monarchic power, just because they preferred it to the other lay and nobility that was pretty aggressive and troublesome and unruly, and would expand also into ecclesiastical domains. So the idea of a solid, a monarchic figure that could bring order in this chaos meant to put an end to at least the major usurpations of ecclesiastical properties and rights, a bit like it was the same for the imperial prerogatives and rights. The idea that there had to be an order, was some public property, public good, that domain that belonged to the king, and that had to be safeguarded. So bishops were easier to switch than lay noblemen, simply because they didn't have hereditary domains. It's a bit more complicated than this, because naturally there were lots of familiar policies also into the clergy, and the point is that there's not this huge difference, but still there is an internal function of the church that objectively leads to this more to this succession of bishops that is based, in fact, on more on a kind of a election, depending on it influenced it, but that could bring, in fact, to a switch of the singular elements. And yet, naturally, the church wanted still its own sphere. So this went along with several, immunities that were granted by the emperor, and so on. But in the general process, and that's, this is kind of partly the deterior side that the Rome was lamenting, in the measure in which, in this way, the emperor could create its kind of a private clientele. So a big deal for Rome, and that's where the reforming papacy also expands in, was effectively to control, literally, all the other churches out there. From Rome itself. It was kind of a challenge, even in the same Italy. So you can imagine how it could be in Germany, for example. So naturally, and even the struggle for the investitures, basically, the emperor would maintain kind of more prerogatives in Germany than in Italy, and the papacy vice versa. So there was this also evident geographical watershed that could not be surpassed. But there is also a positive side that was paradoxically appreciated by the same reforming papacy, in the measure in which it eventually the purity and the sanctity of the papacy was stressed. That was this real, concrete interest in electing people of confirmed, let's say, moral, ethical reliability, right? That could be, in fact, worthy and of the episcopal title, right? And this was important because bishops weren't obviously men of power, men of politics, also men of war, telling you the truth, but they had some broader for these very occupations, actually, some broader capacities and abilities and duties, from the education of the community, the creation of certain political theories, also to back the imperial prerogative in one case, of course, from the other, maybe backing the papal one, depending on which party they really belonged to. And they had this critical role in ensuring, kind of the possibility of a moderating solution in Christianity. If you look at the history of the church, basically, even if we like to stress and remember selectively just things like the Crusades, etc., they're also in there are terribly complicated, and we have tried to explain it in Schwerpunkt. Actually, in the church in the Middle Ages and also in other ages did actually an awful lot of good in terms of of try to make a concerted effort of all the various communities that made up Christianity, and to work together to build certain political structures, and to pacify and to bring to a sort of consensus and cooperation. It's not a few. And if you study medieval sources, you realize that objectively the church had a positive impact on many occasions. Think about it was sometimes, and very often actually, as always, very it was an evident interest of the same church for the sake of itself. But as a result, it brought to a spin-off that did really a lot of good. Think about the pacification here during the 11th century, the pieces, the truces of God and the pieces of God. Eventually, the idea that Christianity had more or less to channel its own forces towards some kind of productive tasks, instead of keeping to murder each other like it was pretty, like it would always remain. But trying to however frame this violence, these activities, into a kind of a more constructive direction, hence the Crusades, etc. These are concepts that are slowly being formulated now, and they went along with, in fact, a process of acculturation, of education that can't remain unnoticed in the general computation of what the history of the church, etc. And this is very important. We will try to deepen it a little bit as a topic in the future. So the thing had started chiefly in Germany. I mean, this idea that the clergy had to be selected for its moral virtues had started first in Germany, where the Ottonians had set this trend for which the church had to be the natural ally of the empire, and therefore, however, this entailed also the recognition of a certain authority, so a protection over the church in turn of a support, and also this interference of the German king in the ecclesiastical affairs. Obviously, it wasn't always so direct, but also in here you have to understand that it was not ever a direct submission of the church to the monarch. It was more of a recognition of equal power on kind of different grounds, but at the same level, right? So it was a big deal to have obtained this, because especially in Germany, where basically was no way at this point to centralize power more than much. Moving on these levels was the only way to maintain an effective power for the monarchy. And the same thing had been exported into Italy, right? But the Germans were the ones that were saying, kind of, we were the one who started this, so we are the one who truly care, while you in Rome are always quarreling and making a mess and wanting to be something else fundamentally and to keep. But probably in here the empire underestimated what was happening in Rome. At least it overly simplified it, because to the German eyes, to the emperor, right, to the imperial power proper, and also for part of the German clergy, the deal was they hear that it's just those Roman families that exploit the fact that Rome is far on kind of the frontier of the empire, and it doesn't, and we can't always reach it from the north, but we should always arrive there and establish our imperial authority, and to have it recognized from the papacy and controlling the papal election and peace, right? But it's not that simple. The Roman Church was definitely developing since a long time, and especially from the beginning of the 11th century, a new capacity of vision of itself into into Christendom and its role, its directive rule. That if it had not yet been formalized, at least was looking towards this truly ecumenic reconnection of Christianity under papal authority on the base of the same morality, in fact, that the Germans were stressing. This is important because it's as if it was a weapon that effectively worked for the Reformed papacy, even after, in fact, these events against the Holy Roman Emperors, and therefore in a fashion that was attacking on this sound spiritual ethical base. Like, the papacy now has an intrinsic morality that is to be recognized in a truly universal sense, and that wants to become, or even to exceed, with the reforming papacy proper, the same imperial authority, right? And that was, the big change. But the perspective, and going on, among all the popes that we listed before, wanted by Henry III, he who left the longest lasting mark was definitely Leo IX. So Leo IX is saint of the Catholic Church. He was born in Alsace in 1002. He was son of the he came essentially from the family of the Counts of Egisheim, and he was baptized with the name of Bruno, right? So he was a student, eventually a priest in Toul, when the bishop of this city died in 1026. So at that point, Bruno, that at this was in Lombardy, close to Conrad II, the Holy Roman Emperor, was cousin of his own parents, was designated by the emperor himself to succeed the bishop. So on May the 19th, 1026, Bruno took possession of his seat at Toul, and eventually on September the 19th, very soon afterwards, in this sense, was consecrated by the Archbishop of Trier. So here we're talking really about high levels of the imperial clergy, very important authorities. So for 22 years, Bruno carried out his episcopal action in a region like Lorraine, where in being essentially in between France and Germany, Bruno could become aware directly of the ecclesiastical situation of the two countries, and into which, already with Rotarius of Liège and also more recently with Vasson of Liège, there had certain doctrines of ecclesiastical reformation had been elaborated, right? Never underestimate also in this sense what the papacy was doing within the same ecclesiastical channels European-wide, right? It was not just a Roman thing. The instances of reform that eventually brought to the Reformation of the Church were Italian. Actually, they also had this monastic character coming from central Italy. We made a video, I don't remember, I think it's the down of Papal monarchy, but I'm not sure either. We talk a bit about that. But there was this general perception, this general ideological, let's say, ferment that was agitating the chiefly the intellectuals in the clergy everywhere in Europe at this point, that was felt the need to formulate a new vision, a new program, right? In fact, the one to which Bruno was acquainted with the so-called the Lorrainese program, that basically patrocinated the comeback to the old rules of episcopal election by the people and clergy. This is something we will see later. That so this idea that the imperial action had to be kind of out of the story, like that the ecclesiastical business was fundamentally related to the local church and in this sense the people and the clergy, and not by other secular powers. This is important because you realize that these prelates were very close. They were still kind of a part of the imperial milieu, even from their families, were some of the most powerful secular families in Europe. But they still, once they entered in the clergy, they recognized the potential that the church had in organizing itself in some kind of distinguishing faction from the empire, and it was deeply felt because indeed the interference of the secular powers on the ecclesiastical affairs was evident. There is also the problem of the monastic reform that is all intertwined, and it's very difficult to talk about this topic actually because there are so many different factors that interplay. But there was this evidence of, for example, of simoniac ordinations of the clergy. That was a problem that had to be eliminated. This was this complete idea of complete freeing of the apostolic see from the interference of the empire, and especially in those matters that were the most important. That was the episcopal and papal elections. So really deciding what the elites of the church had to be, right? So these ideas are important because eventually influenced very much also the spiritual orientation of the future Pope Leo IX, and so he was the kind of the first figure that brought the the church on the path of the reform, and this was one of the German popes that had been chosen kind of for the kind of opposite direction by the emperor, and that eventually, in fact, paved the road to the action of Nicholas II. We will see later, and Gregory VII, that today we don't talk about. That is kind of this iconic figure for which the same reforms take their name from. So at this moment, the Bishop Bruno limited his reforming activity just to extend to the monasteries of his own diocese the Cluniac reform, but that had dealt exactly with this problem, very deep problem at that point of the reformation of the Benedictine rule, and in this extending powers of his net of monasteries were becoming extremely powerful. And in December 1048, at the Diet of Worms, his imperial cousin Henry III elected Bruno as successor of Pope Damasus II. So Bruno, at this point, you've been elected Pope by the emperor, or you have by the same emperor. So at this point, Bruno was kind of an inner conflict, as he was a reformer himself. So he refused to consider himself Pope. This is big. If the acclamation from the side of the Roman people and clergy had not happened, this thing of the Roman people and clergy was very, very important during the papal elections, because that was the tradition, right? And the people of Rome, in this sense, was considered, as well as the clergy of Rome, was already considered something extra, something more, right? The same imperial crowning was a proof of this. The imperial crowning of the Holy Roman Emperor had to happen at this point, not just because the Pope called him and crowned him, end of the story. No, was the whole Roman people and clergy who had to acclaim the emperor, and so this city had already reached this such high level of prestige, for which even the Church of Rome proper was a step ahead, above, let's say, all the others in its importance. So that was definitely the papal church, and if someone had to be elected pope as well, that had to pass through the usual tradition. So in this way, Bruno showed very clearly how the so-called Lorrainese ideas had definitely made an effect, had an effect on him. And on February the 2nd, 1049, he was nevertheless acclaimed Pope by the Roman people, and in let's say on February the 12th, he was solemnly settled in his successor, Vicary of Christ, successor Peter, as the name of Leo the Ninth. So during the 5 years of his pontificate, Leo operated very, very actively, very energically in favor of the reform of the church. He surrounded himself with certain collaborators that, just like him, were following the Lorrainese program. There are important names like Humbert of Moyen-Moutier, Hag of Silva Candida, Odo of Toul, Frederick of Lorraine. But there are, however, some also debates relatively, for example, that he was already in contact with Ildebrand of Sovana, the future Gregory VII, that Leo had contacts with in Rome, as this direct inspirer of the ecclesiastical policy of the papacy. This is not quite clear. However, Leo crossed thrice the Alps to carry out certain long journeys into France and Germany, and he called at least 11 councils. Some are very important, especially the ones of the 4 councils of Rome. There was the one from 9 to 15 April 1041, the one of April 1050, the Easter of 1051, and the Eastern of 1053. Then the councils of Rheims from October 3 to the 4th of 1049, the one of Mainz in October 1049, and the one of Vercelli in September 1051. Right. But looking at the reforming action carried out by Leo IX, we notice that only in France the Pope managed clearly to applicate fully the Laurenais program and to impose his will to Henry I. For the rest, the reform, it's true, it's not led just by single initiatives of some bishop. It does have a kind of a universal character, and it's also wanted actually with this direct unity of action, not anymore by the emperor, like at the time of Henry II, for example, but by the Holy See. Indeed, this Reformation finds its own theoretical confirmation in the publishing around the mid 11th century of a series of texts contained in the Primatu Romane Ecclesia, so the primacy of the Church of Rome, that is part in turn of the Collectio Septuaginta Quator Titulorum, so the collection of the 74 titles. These are texts maybe we skip now, but the concept is that this texts are also influenced by the pseudo-Isidorian decretals and also by Saint Cyprian, that were claiming the privileges and the rights of the Holy See. So the reform makes this big effort to eradicate simony and to impose the celibate to the clergy that was still not universal, to favor especially the reform among the monasteries of the Cluniac reform. But there is a great but, because here it seems that certain times, and also here we can't really see it clearly because the sources are what they are, that it kind of becomes more of a sort of strictly moral reform rather than an ecclesiastical political one. And in Italy and in Germany, so in the lands that were subject to the emperor, it kind of went on, but kind of in a cautious way, and with a great respect of the civil power, right? So the secular power. So it definitely is influenced by the Italian episcopate. Was always favorable to a kind of a agreement between papacy and empire, because the Italian episcopate at this point was the one that since Ottonian times had managed to recover to obtain, thanks to the empire, the control of the cities and obtaining comital dignities. Obviously the ecclesiastical the Italian church was all about this alliance for sure, for securing its own prestige, and However, the reform started by Leo doesn't have kind of a full and logical development. So that would give this guarantee of continuity, for example, that only the actions of Nicholas II and Gregory VII would set, right? Also in here, bear in mind that they could die out, like even at the death of Gregory VII, it seems that the Reformation was kind of over, so there were further developments that would change the thing, but the concept at this point that was set was that there could be something that could be put in motion, could be directed by the papacy proper, right? So the following popes would start subtracting definitely the election of the papacy to of the popes to the emperor's will, and yet Leo the IX kind of didn't obtain this. So we could say more. For example, that Leo IX was, after all, always a man of Henry III, right? So he was a pope chosen by the emperor. That that evidently had been placed there to satisfy the imperial policy at the end of the day. So definitely wasn't the worst candidate for imperial policy if he had been chosen by the emperor himself. And at the same time, there is the problem that of the Normans, because an eventual conflict with the emperor also meant that the papacy would remain uncovered now from the Norman threat in the south. So there was this need to kind of keep everyone at bay, not to make Rome overwhelmed, as it would happen later on, actually. And maybe we can skip a bit of the Norman policy, but it's equally important because you know that Leo IX at a certain point gets taken prisoner by the Normans because of the defeat of Civitate, right? So that's quite an important event that maybe we can look at it, because since the beginning of his pontificate, his first travel into southern Italy is in 1049. Leo IX had a considerable interest for southern Italy, where the Normans of Aversa and Melfi, that Henry III had taken under his own protection in 1037, were the cause of continuous turmoil among within the populations that were damaged by the methods with which the Normans themselves were working at strengthening their domain. The connections with the papacy in southern Italy are very old, and at this point the papacy is trying, in fact, also thanks to this revived imperial power into Italy, to frame this at this point still fragmented territory, politically speaking, under the papal influence, right? And the Normans are at this point just a small power. Like they are considerably strong, but as we know, their history went slowly at the beginning. Before the conquest of Sicily, they were a power that were even able to defeat the papacy, as we will in battlefield, as we will see now. But they still had to find their own political frame, right? So in stability at the end of the day. So in 1051 at Benevent, the Normans had become such a trouble that the city gave itself to the papacy. So Benevent was the last Lombard territory in Italy that, with Dukes Pandulf and Landulf, decided, we are surrounded by the Normans. We rather than falling to them that we have been fighting up to this point, we entrust ourselves to the papacy. And so it happened, actually. And Benevent will remain, in fact, even in the future centuries, papal enclave into southern Italy in the kingdom of the Normans, but still, in fact, a papal possession. In fact, the same Henry III had recognized in 1052 the Pope with his own rights on Benevent and southern Italy at large. So, in turn, and this is interesting because it makes you observe how different things were in Italy and in Germany. Leo, as a compensation, renounced in favor of the emperor to his own rights on the Abbey of Fulda. It was one of the most powerful abbeys in Germany, and as well as in the diocese of Bamberg, right? That was in fact the original one, as we have seen before. So the Pope had therefore it was kind of a goal, right? Because had cleverly exploited the malaise of the populations and the contrast with the Normans and the Dukes of Benevent to achieve this solid. Benevent was a very important city, was very strong. It maintained its strategic relevance, even if still surrounded by the Normans, and especially this connection with the papacy was strengthening the same the connection between the two areas. But at the same time, there was a situation now that created further conflict, because the situation was pretty messed up in general now with Normans, because the Normans were military powerful, and the Pope couldn't do excessively against them. So the emperor intervened rarely into Italy, at least directly speaking. So now with the war with the Normans, things were a bit complicated to manage. Leo IX at this point even asked for help to Argyros. There was the captain actually of the Byzantine of Italy, Byzantine Italy, and against the Normans, and practically they launched jointly an expedition against the Normans in the spring of 1053 that resulted into the disasters of Civitate. Actually, there were even German Swabian mercenaries in there, so it was a kind of a good coalition, but the lack of troops that Henry III had promised to him made it end. Like the army was composed almost exclusively by these German mercenaries, and also during the campaign, the same Byzantines had not joined the papal army. They had not been able to reunite. So this defeat at Civitate is quite famous. Maybe one day we will talk more in detail about this. The Norman cavalry at this point really does a pretty good job. And this battle, it was fought on the river Fortore between the June the 17th, 18th, 1053, and that's where Leo was captured by the Normans and brought to Benevent, ironically, a few days later. And he was released only on March the 12th, 1054, after, in all likelihood, confirmed to the Normans the possession of the territories that they had occupied within the former Longobarд Principate of Benevent. So Benevent, although remained to the Pope, and Leo's life ended shortly after he came back to Rome on April the 19th, 1054. So in all this situation, during the prisoning of Leo IX the Benevolent, the culminant moment of the conflict between the Latin Church and the Church of Constantinople happened. This was produced at that point by a text that Leo, Bishop of Akritas in Bulgaria, had produced, but that was basically provoked by the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius, and in spite of the intervention of Argyris, that was worried by the events of the policy, let's say, for the faith of the policy with Rome and the agreement with the Latins of Italy. And in spite of the goodwill also of the Emperor Constantine Monomachus and the diplomacy of the Cardinal Humbert of Moyen-Moutier and the long memory of Leo IX, Michael was eventually excommunicated when Leo was already dead. This happened on July the 15th, 1054, and this would basically be the prelude of the definitive break between the Latin Church and the Greek one. That definitely was to influence also the world as we know it, as the schism is basically still not recomposed, as you know, so it would bring to definitive break. So Leo IX, Leo IX's successors persecuted his own policy. The context in which they operated was, however, very different now. In 1056, Henry III had also died, and the new emperor was his son, Henry IV, that, however, was still a minor. Right? It was quite a big deal. So in this vacuum of power, it was the Roman aristocracy that took over once again. And they began to reassert Roman authority in certain areas and to confrontate with other powers of central Italy. For example, the most important ones, for example, the family of Canossa-Lorraine, that in those years had achieved this very speedy rise, and that had brought under his own control wide areas of central Italy and the Apennine passes. And so this new certainty of this new situation of uncertainty was reflected also in the very fast succession of popes that were backed by the various sides. A new turn happened with the election of Pope Nicholas II, who was backed actually by the reforming party and by the Canossa-Lorraine family. So he could restart basically the anti-Simoniac policy. Nicholas II was named Gerard. He was born in Chevron in Savoy in 980, and eventually he would die in Florence in 1061. He had become pope in 1058, and with thanks to the imperial militias, so always with the imperial backing, he threw out of Rome anti-pope Benedict X. Nicholas, as we have said, was a decisive maker of the ecclesiastical reform. He called this Lateran Council that in April 1059 decreed that the papal election was reserved to only to the cardinals, by excluding the intervention of the Roman nobility and limiting the role of an imperial of the emperor in this let's say consent for the papacy. This is very important because this measure is known as the in nomine Domini, so in the name of God, which was the pontifical bull that Nicholas promulgated on April the 12th, 1059. And it's better known with the Decretum in electione papae, right? So this the content of this script is that is to regulate essentially the papal election, right? In the Lateran Synod of April the 13th, he basically modified the terms of papal election, and the new rules were published in the in nomine Domini bull. So the bull contemplated that at the death of the Pope, only the cardinal bishops could maintain the prerogative of electing the new successor. They had to reunite in an assembly. Excuse me, here I'm closing one thing. They had to close in an assembly, and the candidate who would have obtained more votes would have become Pope. Eventually, the presbyter cardinals and the diacon cardinals would have associated to the decision. So the important thing, though, is that Nicholas II excluded in this way the participation of the emperor to the active election of the Pope, reserving it to exclusively to the cardinal bishops. Right. The decree also contemplated that in the presence of circumstances that could prevent the free assembly of the subjects in Rome, the election could be carried out also in another locality, maintaining the same validity of the election happened in Rome. So the decree also attributed further to only to cardinal bishops the responsibility of the Roman Church during the period of vacancy between one pope and another. So the decree finally specified that the validity of the election was immediate. So the Roman Pope elected in this way could enter in full possession of his faculties of chief of the Universal Church at the same end of the election, and therefore even before his crowning. Right, this is particularly important. And present to the writing of the decree, there was also the future Pope Gregory VII, Hildebrand of Soana, who seemingly gave a substantial contribution to the writing. And as other two very important figures, the Cardinals Humbert of Silva Candida, that was Humbert of Moyen-Moutier, and Pierre Damiani, that was also one of the most important theologians and bishops and cardinals, also proclaimed doctor of the Church by the same Catholic Church. So this document was of dramatic importance because, as you realize, it had de facto legalized the procedure through which he himself had been brought on the pontifical soil, with complete disregard towards the previous Constitutio Romana of 824 and the Privilegium Autonis in 962. These two documents were quite important because basically they represented they had represented the the legitimization of the imperial control on the papal election. The Constitutio Romana, also known as Constitutio Lotari, was this imperial pontifical statute in which in 9 chapters was proclaimed that the sovereign could regulate the affairs of Rome, including the election of the Pope, that yes, it had remained a prerogative of the Romans, hence the aristocracy, the people and the high clergy, and that the right of the emperor to confirm, however, the or not, by the way, the rise to the pontifical soil of the newly elected pope. So there were also other norms in this, but the context is clear. The privilegium autonis was in some ways the reconfirmation of this, was emanated in 962 by the newly elected emperor Otto I. Basically, in this context, the Constitutio Romana of Carolingian times had been reconfirmed, and it was also agreed that a papal election had to happen only with the consent of the of the emperor. At that point, it was still not known as Holy Roman Emperor, but it was still the same figure basically, and at the presence of his representatives as well. So Otto I had attributed to himself some real rights on the surveillance, also the military one, on the city of Rome, and in exchange he was, willing to recognize all the donations that had been given to the papacy, made to the papacy since the time of the Promissio Carisiaca by Pippin the Short. So there was this in 754. Even though these territories would remain basically still under imperial tutelage, right? So this meant, in a nutshell, that the papacy had basically been framed within imperial control. The decretum in electione papa is instead very important because it's reversing this. It's saying no, it's not the emperor. The emperor has nothing to do with this. It's the cardinals it's the collegium of cardinals that, when we talk about cardinals now, we don't have to think of like all the cardinals from all over the Christendom. It was meant like the cardinals here were the ones around Rome that were traditionally the only ones who had and could elect the Pope, because they were basically the representatives of the suburbicarian seats of the Roman Church. So they had, after the Pope, they were let's say the second in the hierarchy, right? So they were the extremely powerful individuals, by the way, that in fact were also appointed, as we've seen, by the same emperors for the sake of controlling the Roman papacy. So this is fundamental because at this point, in this new form, the emperor couldn't do anything more about the pontifical election. He couldn't elect the Pope. He couldn't even confirm the Pope. It was just an inner business of the Roman Church, and that's pretty much it, right? So the right of choosing the Pope now is a task that belongs exclusively to the cardinals, right? So all these bishops, priests, and deacons that were title owners of the Roman basilicas and its most immediate nearby, so that were known as cardinal churches because they were in fact the cardinal, like the the center of what the where the Roman Church stood, right? So on the basis of this decree, the cardinals had to elect the Pope proper. So then they had to talk with the cardinal priests and at the end with the clergy and the Roman population that had to give their own approval and acclamation of the new Pope, right? The thing was, it was relatively machinous, but it was so in reality it was probably simpler. But the problem is that for the emperor, at least at this point, is that it's being confirmed as a completely internal prerogative of the Roman Church. There is no one who can interfere into this from the external. right? Um, the ascent of the emperor was not completely surpassed, meaning that there were certain ambiguous norms that were very subject to to subjective interpretation that created new conflicts. Um, and it's without, it's pretty obvious that all of this could not be easily accepted by the imperial court, and this was extremely clear when the successor of Nicholas II had to be elected, right? Um, so the the break between the papacy and the empire, in the meanwhile, even pushed the Normans to find new alliances. And in fact, in 1059, Nicholas II himself agreed at Melfi with the Normans of Robert Guiscard by essentially accepting his rule over the duchies of Apulia, Calabria, and Sicily in exchange of the feudal homage to the papacy. Right. This was another crucial event in high medieval history because it would bring to the vassalage of the southern kingdom in Italy throughout the centuries, and basically the nominal papal control on this newly on this new power that basically in southern Italy had never quite had anything like before. So reuniting a land that was had been split, had been divided for literally, since the times of the Longbard migration. So from all basically half of a millennium. It was a very important phase of history, and so in the Pope at this point could obtain the Norman help also to seize the anti-pope of Nicholas II that had fortified himself in a locality known as Galeria, and that was eventually deposed by the council. In 1060, Nicholas II emanated also the famous decrees against simony that would have even more bittered the clash between church and empire, and of which Nicholas was about to sustain the blow when the response when he died, and that's where Alexander II and eventually after him Gregory VII enter into play. So Alexander II was not recognized by the imperial court with this new form of election, right? That instead counterposed to him another pope known as Honorius II. So Alexander II was known as Anselm from Baggio, who was from basically in the nearbys of Milan, and he we don't know where he was born actually, but he died eventually in Rome in 1073. It's kind of a long pontificate, and he had been Bishop of Lucca in Tuscany in 1057, and also pontifical legate in Milan with Hildebrand, future Gregory VII, and Pier Damiani, that promoted the reform of the church at this point. So he succeeded to Nicholas II on October 1st, 1061, and as we've seen, while the emperor didn't recognize his election, he said the Normans did. This is also very important because always remember that the Holy Roman Emperors were trying constantly to reconquer, to conquer proper actually southern Italy that was contended with the Byzantines, right? So the rise of the Normans was a completely new thing now. After centuries of struggle, essentially, there had been other local powers like the Lombard principalities that had kind of remained in the middle, but the Normans were quite different now. They were extremely aggressive, and they had a power that nobody basically had ever managed to achieve, because they had managed to rise from within the Longobard principalities. So it's entering that system like mercenaries that they could take power from the within, while before it was always the usual clash from the external between the Byzantines, the Longobards, etc. And there was definitely a contrast also not just from the imperial side, but from the pro-imperial clergy. Cadalus, Bishop of Parma, for example, was an imperial figure, was in fact named as Honorius II, and together with him sided other ecclesiastics. So there was a series of clashes, even within Rome itself, between the followers of the two parties, and there was a new attempt at one point to mediate, and Godfrey of Lorraine intervened into this. In this council, happened at Augustine 1062, and the position of Alexander II was defended by Pier Damiani, and this figure, even without the acknowledgement of the Pope, proposed to submit the question to a council, the matter to a council that happened in Mantua in 1064. So Alexander II on this occasion was recognized universally as Pope, right? And eventually Honorius II basically renounced, and so they didn't do much else. So this last, however, in the second part, let's say, of Alexander's pontificate, there was the further implementation of the reform of the church, and with the condemnation of the simoniac clergy, of the concubinate of the clergy, and at the same time tying ever more the alliance with the Normans, and bringing into a position that was ever more hostile to the empire. And there is also a very important, we talked about the Pataria, for example, on Schwerpunkt. It's all in the Papal playlist if you're interested into it. Alexander II protected the Pataria movement. There was in Milan. That was for reasons that go take that video. I don't remember the title, but I think I'll give you two in a second. However, it was a way basically to embrace certain movements of protest that were criticizing the clergy in this sense. And here the title of the video: Before the Gregorian Reforms, Cluny, Hermitage, and Pataria, right? And in that video it explains how now the instances of reformation of the church were being embraced by the same church proper, so that those who were criticizing the elites in Milan at that point were seeing in the papacy a kind of an intermediate that could intervene against the oppressive elites. And this was very important for the papacy, because the papacy had always taken this, had always tried to extend its power in the rest of Italy, and trying to basically eliminate or at least to downsize the various competitors of the Italic clergy that existed, because cities like Ravenna or Milan or others were quite important in their archbishoprics, were definitely in competition with Rome. So now Rome was exploiting these instances of ecclesiastical reform by saying, now we're the truly reformed church, so now we're really making a change, right? And it's also very important that it was Alexander II that approved the Norman expedition in England in 1066. This is quite important because it was, aside from naturally the European history and all the dramatic importance of the Battle of Hastings and the creation of the Anglo-Norman kingdom, there is this effort from a strictly papal perspective now to direct political and military actions, like the Norman conquest of England, in the name of the papacy, essentially, with a blessing of the papacy at least, which meant that the papacy was trying to surpass monarchical authority in the process. Like at that point, the Duke of Normandy was relatively autonomous, but was still technically a vassal of the French king. So by doing this, the papacy was trying to overstep the same monarchs, and this is something that incidentally we discussed exactly a few days ago when we were talking about not a very few days ago, but the evolution of Holy War from the call of God to the regulated crusade, 11th, 13th century. And in that video, I stress the importance of the reforming papacy in the creation and the indiction of the same crusade, meaning that if there hadn't been this will to basically go beyond secular lay authority, let's say, and therefore to surpass the great secular powers of the emperors and of the kings, even the crusades would have not been launched in the way we know it, and especially the first crusade is a product and a success of the reforming papacy. And in fact, it's not led by kings. Kings do not have control on that. They will start having it only from the second, when they will have understood the potential of this mechanism, and that the reforming papacy had already won, by the way, the first round, the most important round of the struggle for investitures. So the papacy was thinking of itself like a power that could even control political and military affairs, something unknown to the very few years before, relatively few years before. Surely a very different perspective from the one of Constantinople, with which Rome had remained a lot in contact, like throughout all the time. So it's a great cultural step that was not foreseen, and that caught unprepared many, the same empire and many monarchies, because the popes had spotted their weakness and exploited it perfectly. In a world where monarchies are still frail and there's no real centralization in their construction, in their structure, and things are evolved very slowly. Of course, if the papacy doesn't have direct control on those Christian principalities, but still there's Christian vassals, but still can say, I tell you to do that in the name of Rome, in the name of the papacy, in the name of Christ. And you can also not listen to your kings that are trying essentially to subdue you, to subject you in a way or another. You can do great things. So this was a big problem that for which the papacy could have gone even more far than one way. We know eventually the monarchies managed to retain their own power, but still the papal monarchy proper managed to go beyond and to reach results, to achieve results that a very few time before were not even imaginable, right? And there were many risks, right? There were also heresies starting to spread, so it was a real challenge, and things could have gone easily in a different fashion at one point. So looking in perspective in the time of a few albeit tormented decades, the Roman Church had managed to give itself a new hierarchical structure. The intellectuals of the reforming area had further more elaborated new ideological instrument that, by emphasizing the role of the papacy and representing a new morality, um, had taken away in parallel to the imperial charge those elements of sacrality that had distinguished it since the age of Charlemagne. Never forget this. I was realizing that the other day when we were talking about the admonitio ad ordines, I don't remember here which was the Ludovican admonitio, yeah, the admonitio ad omnes regni ordines, yeah, here it was. So the admonishment to all the orders of the kingdom and of the empire at that point, and the concept of how far the empire had begun to stress actually the same thing. Because let's be honest about it, one major factor of the of the reforming papacy was the emulation, albeit of different bases, of the concepts of sacrality of the empire that the emperors had started to develop actually very early in time, since the time of Charlemagne. Even before, like in the case of the Franks, there had been a very long tradition of sacrality of the monarchy that had started within the Frankish Gallic Church, that was stressing this unity, this alliance between the monarch and the clergy, right? That would definitely go towards a sacralization of power, and this had naturally been aided by the creation of the empire proper. I mean, with the crowning of Charlemagne as Roman emperor, and further implemented in Ottonian times, where the even policy of the bishop counts that we named before, and the general development of a political theory that could equate the Ottonian Empire to the Byzantine one for obvious reasons, and also for the dynastic ties that occurred at an imperial level between the two empires, definitely inspired the church and made it understand that the true sacrality there really belonged to Rome by definition, but could be implemented against those same powers. And I don't know whether sometimes we give for the greatness of the reform of the Gregorian reforms is not much, in fact, this just the consequences. It's really thinking on how they began, right? And if you look at in perspective, you may even say that the papacy was aware of this role, but up to one point had never quite had even the reason probably to back these prerogatives, that they had never quite at one point it was enough for being between the German Empire and the Byzantine Empire for Rome, even just geographically, to get one from the other, right? But at the same time, it was this need of military protection that had become difficult to maintain. So at this point, the German Empire doesn't quite manage to restore the power on Italy that it had previously. Yes, there are these expeditions, but they are kind of episodic, and they would, at the end of the day, be pushed away, even by the same papacy, because at this point the papacy knows that it has other means to achieve this goals, including the rise of the Normans in the south, because that was objectively now a new presence that the church could tie to itself, instead of fighting against it in order to expand their own power, in theory, in fact, against the same emperor, right? There was active warfare, in fact, between imperials and Normans at this point. The following years will be also brutal in many ways, but the Rome was sacked, and it was pretty tough. We will see it on another occasion, but the important part of the story is still the great system that the church was able to think more than, and it definitely came from centuries of meditation, of awareness of the primacy of honor that the Roman Church had since, and this ability of exploiting the political fragmentation of Italy to carve slowly this real power, right? That wasn't very big from a strictly military point of view, but that definitely was based on Rome. It was a hell of a city. Was very well placed. It was rich. It had these resources. It had its own prestige that evidently was feared by many. So these ideological weapons are terribly effective, and they manage to play on the obvious centrifugal pushes of the nobility of the various imperial vassals that can at this point exploit the clash between papacy and empire to weaken the latter in order to maintain its own autonomies and prerogatives at a local level. And the papacy struggled in the process, right? As much as the empire did, and as much as other powers did. So the whole thing is very, very complicated, and maybe we will explain it better another day, because we didn't quite talk about the clash for investitures proper ever. We kind of looked mostly at this previous phase that needs to be understood, needs to be conceived, and it's very difficult to do. I must tell you, this is really a history of institutions, of ideology, of political theory. So there is a lot to know that is not so immediate, and it quite takes a time. Also, today we didn't talk much about the Cluniac reform either, what all these previous monastic elements had played on in this context, because they were quite important as well. However, for now I think it's enough. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.